Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm the executive producer here in the Green Space at WNYC in New York City. We are coming at you live. Usually I come out here on this stage and there's a lot of people in the room. Right now it's just another producer and our tech director, and they're very socially distant from me at the moment, as are all the other people that produced this show and made it possible tonight. So we hope that all of you watching are keeping safe and taking care of yourselves where you are, and that while we are all apart from one another, that you'll come here where we'll be streaming some shows live remotely from our studio. There'll be talk, there'll be music, there'll be news, there'll be performances. And if you sign up for our newsletter at thegreenspace.org, you'll find out about our streaming schedule. And you'll also be able to, when you watch live, interact with us. So if you can send us an email or hashtag on social, you'll be able to talk to the people that you see on our stage when you tune in. And we're doing this here in the Green Space because we do want to make sure that we try to stay connected with each other and stay creative and stay inspired until the day comes when we can welcome you back here in person with us in our studio. So to that end, thank you for tuning in. I also want to thank all the members of WNYC and WQXR. We are listener-supported public radio here in New York City, and also the Jerome L. Green Foundation for their support of our work and what we're doing here as we keep serving this community. So thanks again. Hope to see you in person soon. And now here is your host tonight, Angélique Roché.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all for tuning in. I am really excited that we had this opportunity to kind of switch gears now. And I think Jennifer hit on so many great points in this idea of community and being malleable, and this concept of really talking about what are the big questions that we're confronted with. You know, it has all kind of made us reevaluate, I think, particularly on the power of digital connections and this availability of what is intimacy. What is this concept of not just intimacy in a romantic kind, but like this personal connection, these physical connections that we sometimes take for granted, i.e. being on the MTA and being too close. I'm sure many of us miss these small things that we are now avoiding because of social distancing. And it's very interesting because about 2 weeks ago, I was following one of my favorite Twitter accounts. We are Twitter associates, Kelly, aka Mocha Mama, and she tweeted something very unique. She said she was going to do a social experiment. While many of us are in isolation, we use each other. Let's use each other's names more often as we respond to each other, which is very interesting because a lot of us who, particularly first generation adopters, have been using screen names, whether it's our real name or like Poet Kitten, which was my first AOL screen name, and we can talk about that later if you want to ask about it. We've been using screen names for a very long time, even atting people's screen names now in this new society. And she says, what does it feel like to see your own name? If anyone is game for this during your social media actions today, I just don't want to go nuts. Like this idea that is so impersonal and so disconnected when we're just adding an account and not talking to a person. And in that moment, I saw an exchange that she had with another Twitter user, Christina, and Christina and Kelly were using each other's names. And so I was like, you know what? I'm game. This actually looks pretty great. And so I responded to them and I was like, man, this is really powerful, using words to make sure someone feels seen, even when you are not seeing them. And in that moment, they both responded and they both used my first name. And I instantaneously felt seen through the mere words on this platform that is notorious for being toxic, right? And it was powerful. It was this honesty that made me feel like, okay, can this medium, this platform, this space of the internet that's gotten such a weird name, some say bad name, I think that's a gray area, for pulling us apart and making us more divided, bring us together. And so we have some incredible guests here tonight in this virtual space as we ask the very big question that I think is on everyone's mind right now as we are adjusting to a new reality. Can tech bring us together at a time like this? Before we get to the guests, I do want to say Tonight, we're going to try not to confuse the words and the terms social distancing, self-isolation, self-quarantine, and quarantine. Our apologies in advance if anyone does. We do understand that social distancing is a practice. Self-isolation is something that we are doing right now in order to keep other people healthy. Self-quarantine is dealing with folks who are dealing with much more exacerbated issues of exposure, and quarantine even more exacerbated than that. And so we don't want to confuse that out of respect for everyone who's dealing with what they are dealing with this evening. Also, in the spirit of connection, we want you to be part of the conversation too. So you can, as Jen said, you can engage with us in 3 ways. You can go on to Twitter, tweet at the Green Space, and that's TheGreene space SPACE, and use the hashtag VBQ. You can go on to Instagram and comment on the show's Instagram post on the Green Space NYC. And for those of you who are not on the Twitters or the Grams, you can email us at thegreenSpace@wnyc.com. That being said, I am excited to introduce our amazing panelists this evening who have been so patiently waiting in this Brady Bunch that I am seeing that you guys aren't seeing in this virtual green room. First, we have Alana, who is the program director at New Media Mentors, a project of Netroots Nation, leading digital strategy trainings online and off, as well as trainings and integrating popular culture into campaigns. Think Harry Potter social organizing. It's a real thing, I promise you, and it's amazing. She's also worked at the intersection of popular culture and online organizing for over a decade, connecting nonprofits with pop culture creators and fans, and applying those lessons of storytelling to the fight for social and economic justice. She hosts Graphic Policy Radio podcasts, where comics and politics meet. Next, we have Ashley Fetters, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she reports on relationships and families, which I know all of us are dealing with right now, and Dr. Gail Saltz. So Dr. Gail Saltz has an incredible bio. She's an clinical associate professor of psychiatry with the New York Presbyterian Hospital and a psychoanalyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, best known for her work as a relationship, family, and emotional well-being and mental health wellness contributor in the media, where she frequently shares her expertise and commentary on the mental health aspects of current issues and news. She is also a best-selling author of numerous books, including her most recent, The Power of Different, The Link Between Disorder and Genius. She is also the host of a new podcast, Personology, from iHeartRadio. I love it. I love that name. So welcome all of you to the panel.
Thank you.
So I want to kick it off. I want to get a little bit personal first to kind of like set the tone, but also to give you guys a little chance to warm up, because there is a lack of body language for the first time here. You guys have obviously been social distancing and self-isolation in your own ways, and you've been adjusting to this new norm. Can you say, like, give us an idea of what has been your digital drug of choice? Like, what is your digital input into this shifting norm of connecting with folks? Anyone can go.
I'll start. So I have been, home from work for a couple of weeks now. Every day is, working remotely. I'm still talking to all of my colleagues, doing our usual meetings that we do over the phone or in person are just happening on Zoom. So that's a big part of my digital human connection diet right now. Also, I will say someone I work with, Caitlin Tiffany, wrote this wonderful piece this week on how it's everyone's moral responsibility to post everything they want or everything happening in their banal, boring lives right now, because, how are we going to see it otherwise? So on Instagram a lot right now, posting my own stuff and looking at everyone else's.
That's really interesting. I work remotely normally because I'm the only person who has my particular job. And so, I've already, I'm someone who is active on Slack all the time with my coworkers, and active on Facebook Messenger a lot with other organizers and other folks, and on Twitter a little bit too much. So I don't know that my technological interaction has changed so much, with the exception of the fact that my friends, because we can't hang out, we've all started a Discord chat, which is definitely something that comes from the gamer community. That's just for my immediate friends circle. And there's channels for talking about your pets versus your kids, mental health, people practicing their French, people practicing their Spanish. And there's a channel for self-promotion wherein I told my friends I would be on this show now. And it has a different feeling than when you're just posting stuff to Facebook, because of, it's like an intimacy within an intimacy, I suppose. And I think that there's a lot of Discord being used now also for folks to group watch things. And that happens on all kinds of social media platforms. But we did a group watch of Dune on Sunday night. David Lynch, of course, the one and only.
What
about yeah, I would say, you know, for my community, mental health professionals, things are really having to change quite a bit. Seeing patients, it's very important to see patients face to face, read body language, for follow-up, to see when there are changes going on, and to establish and continue a relationship. But in the circumstance, we're having to, many people who have practices, myself included, we're having to use telemedicine. And of course, telemedicine has been growing. And so in places where there are fewer mental health professionals, that's been something that's been occurring increasingly over time anyway. But it's been sort of an abrupt shift for many people. We'll see how that plays out, I guess. I think it's certainly better than nothing. And to be able to see patients, at least through a screen, is definitely better than only being able to talk to patients, say on the phone. Collegially, we've moved all meetings to Zoom or some other, and basically, if you are not actually taking care of a patient in the hospital right now, you are really asked to not be at the hospital right now. So that's obviously shifted things dramatically for myself and many people. I actually also had 2 essentially adult daughters return home, because so I can relate to probably many people out there who are, like, wow, a new, I'm trying to work, I'm trying to telemedicine with patients. I've got a college daughter, had to come back. I've got a law school daughter who had to come back and do online courses. I've got a husband who actually is a physician, more on the front lines, dealing with we will not have enough equipment to take care of COVID patients and not get infected ourselves, et cetera. So it's pretty amped up around here, with a lot of changes afoot, but very mindful and seeing all of us, and my daughters included and my husband included, use various platforms, some of which we have not used before, to do everything from work to definitely to socialize. Absolutely.
So that's interesting. And I think that's a really great segue. And you actually answered my first question so beautifully, but this is a good segue. Ilana, one of the things that a lot of folks have been seeing, and I believe this just happened with the Cannes Film Festival today, is that major conferences, major gatherings, Coachella, Jazz Fest in New Orleans, a lot of Comic-Cons, all of these different gatherings that used to exist. And to be honest, these are places where people were already giving out hand sanitizer, and they were already trying not to spread germs. So this was already known as being like a hot spot because people are in such close connection. But, conferences are now trying to pivot. They're now trying to run online. The CUNY school system is closed. We just mentioned like 2 daughters returning home, and people are looking at these alternate social activities and trainings. Like folks are getting Pelotons. Like there's just like this different idea. And this idea of bringing folks together, like someone just mentioned on Chromecast, you can group watch with your friends and everybody has options to pause, right? how does it look like, and that is a real phone ringing, because that's how life is. How does that look now for a national and local situation where we're moving from these spaces that existed very specifically because physical meetings do have a benefit to this necessity of going the way of all online?
So the conference that I co-founded, Organizing 2.0, is on April 17th and 18th. And was going to be in the CUNY school system as part of the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So we're not going to be there in person, as you can probably imagine. And I'm glad we made the call early, because if we were making it at the last second, it would be a nightmare. The good news is that we are very well positioned to be running an online only conference. We're teaching digital organizing skills, and we're digital organizing folks. And I think that the model that we're setting up of a remote conference is things that other people in the activist space, but also in other spaces, will hopefully be able to say, oh, look, this worked, or maybe see something that they would do differently, because it's coming really soon. We're going to be having trainers and speakers from all over the country and all over the world, some of whom would not have been able to participate if we weren't doing this remotely, will be joining in online from home and streaming their sessions. And we're developing new ways for people to have interactions with presenters and with trainers. Everything's going to be recorded on video. It's a really big undertaking. I mean, I think that there are people who would never have been able to be there in person, regardless of the COVID crisis. And I'm glad that this may be more accessible for them now. But my long-term commitment is towards in-person gatherings. There is something more there that you don't get otherwise. But yeah, Organizing 2.0 now online. And I think it's important for people to think about how they're going to structure that pivot for their community and their groups when that may have to happen. And I think we'll have a really meaningful experience. One of the big things people love about conferences is the networking, and the platforms we're looking at have ways for people to do individual networking as spin-off from the actual breakout training sessions they'll be in. And additionally, I'm putting together some recreational stuff for folks to do in the evening. There may be some live role-playing happening, and people would be managed from their own home. We'll have some social justice themed games. There may be some remote karaoke. So we're finding some creative ways to work in the social experience into what's essentially a digital strategy conference, which is also now going to have a ton of content around how do we do mutual aid in the time of COVID. So that's what we're up to.
Yeah, and I'd love to, I want to ask Ashley a quick question, because this does bring up this idea of spontaneity when you talk about this concept of role playing and this concept of online karaoke. Ashley, you've spoken about how we lose things when we're using the digital tools to communicate. People get to prepare. We can autocorrect. If you're on Slack, you can go and edit that typo. Can you share why spontaneity is so important? And then I have a follow-up question to that one.
Sure. So one thing I think about a lot is just kind of how there's a hierarchy of tech communication as it compares to, human face-to-face interaction, right? Like the next best thing I would say is video chat, because you are still seeing people's facial expressions that they're instinctively making after you're saying something to them. You're still hearing their voice and their expressions, and you know what makes them laugh. You know where they're hesitating and like stumbling over their words a little bit. Below that, I would say, is phone calls. You don't get to see the person, but you hear their vocal inflection. You can still pick up a lot of emotional content, and again, know where they're hesitating, or know where they're looking for a word, or know where they're getting emotional. And then way below that is like text-based mediums where you're typing out messages. Like not only do you not see or hear the person you're talking to, but they also don't have to respond right away because they got distracted with something else, or like you're saying, there are things that you can go back and redo, or take time to think about and have your friends talk to you about what you're going to say back, right? So asynchronous communication, you lose all the spontaneity there. And so I think it's, in a lot of contexts, what Gail was saying about, being able to see someone's body language and know, where they are mentally is hugely valuable. And you lose a lot of that with lots of digital communication that doesn't have voice or face interface.
Well, I mean, how can people find ways to connect and allow for spontaneity? Is that only this idea of video chat is it? that's the answer. And is that why we are seeing, like, one of the things everyone has mentioned is Zoom. You're on Zoom, right? This is this concept of this face-to-face interaction ish, screen to screen, camera to camera. But is that what we are looking at now? These different technological advancements that are like the mirror that Facebook pushed up earlier in this decade, and now the new one that they're doing on the TV. Like, is this it? Is this kind of the closest we're going to get?
This is, I would say, and I would love to know what Gail and Alana would say about this, but in my experience and the things that I use from day to day, this is by far the closest approximation of having a real conversation with all of you, sitting on a stage together. I think this is about the best we're going to get right at this moment. Obviously in the future, who knows what's going to happen? We might really get somewhere with very sophisticated holographic technologies. Who knows? But yeah, for now, I would say it's the best approximation that I regularly come in contact with.
And Gail, I actually have a really interesting question. When you were talking about utilizing telemedicine and this concept that you are getting to see people's facial expressions and you are getting to see, hearing their voice because you're able to at least pay attention and be perceptive. Is this going to change? Are these virtual interactions also going to change the study of psychology, the study of psychoanalyzing someone, because they do come off differently and the physical cues can be seen differently through a screen?
I guess I would say, other than being limited and having to rely more heavily on a few things as opposed to having a bigger picture, I would say not. I mean, we know, for example, when someone is depressed, maybe we see a certain flatness of expression or what we call, a smaller range of emotional expression from them. If we are concerned that they have what's called a psychomotor retarded depression, which is different from an agitated depression, and will change what we decide to do with them in terms of both psychotherapy and medication. What we need to see is when they come in, what are their movements like? Do they look really stiff? And when they move their arm, is it really slow? Or are they like this, like, with their hand wringing and looking really agitated? Those are things that a patient may have difficulty putting into words, particularly if they're feeling depressed and they're somewhat cognitively impaired as a result, but you would see as a practitioner. And I do think that if we could have a pretty full screen and we can see a good amount of our patient, then it's a pretty close approximation. We might not get to see them walk in and sit down. I might ask a patient to do that if I thought that would be added value in terms of information. So for example, in some sort of psychiatric / neurologic issues like Parkinson's, you see certain kinds of tremors, you see a certain kind of stiffness in walking. And so we're just going to have to say, hey, this is what we've got. Let's do our best to see as much as we can see. What will change is that we may have to rely more heavily on limited information for making diagnosis. And that still will be better than nothing, I guess I would say.
And that's interesting. I just want to remind everybody while we're doing this that you can ask questions as well. I have a ton, so note that. But also we want to hear from you, the audience, to make sure that you guys are hashtagging VBQ on Twitter, that you are engaging on Instagram, on the post, and emailing in for these amazing panelists. And interestingly enough, that goes to my next question for you, Alana. The census is right now. And I think this is like a very good connection on the idea that limited space is limited information is such a widespread idea. And it's such a dichotomy when you think of all of the information that's at our fingertips, but also people not having access, right? So the census is online, but that one of the big things about the census is participation. And I know particularly in New York, there was huge amounts of money that were going to community organizations to get folks in the community signed up. There was training of census fellows. There was all these different outreach efforts that have been pulled back. And now you're dealing with a system where you're texting, where it's online, where you have to think about, does the person have access to internet? Does the person have a cell phone number that's not a temporary number? What are organizations out there doing to kind of make up for this gap in access to folks that would have normally been accessed by just knocking on their door?
Yeah. I'm so glad you raised that. So right now is when those changes are all being made. Organizations were already expanding their digital capacity in census outreach. Like, I know that there were projects that were coming through, private funding to help reach more folks through social media ads and things like that. But now you have to figure out, how are you going to reach people who, as you said, might not have online access at all? And have this is very important, transient cell phone numbers. So that is being figured out as we speak. People don't have the answers for it. And I hope that people are making commitments to support community organizations who are doing census work, who are going to have to scale up their tech capacity now, and who might not have been able to do that before, because the census is going to determine whether people have the resources in their community they need to survive. I'm hoping that that folks will be able to participate in Organizing 2.0, because we're going to be doing workshops on how to address this sort of stuff. But it's very much a building a plane while we're flying it kind of thing. So because like I said, when groups were increasing their social media outreach to promote census work, but that was targeting people who were going to be accessible through social media in the first place. So we're looking at, like Black and brown youth and queer youth, and not necessarily looking at elderly people who might not be accessible on it. So now how do you expand when you can't door knock, especially for people who might be, immunocompromised and things like that? That's really going to be a change. And there's text banking and text messaging platforms that we have been using for political campaigns and for activism will definitely be a part of it.
Well, and I think that also kind of relates to this other concept of, and I know everyone's asking this question because it's kind of been a joke. Well, while we're self-isolating, dating is now a thing. And I've seen a couple of different articles that have popped up about people on Tinder and OkCupid talking about, how do we date, especially if you just started seeing someone. Like, what do you do now that everyone is self-isolating? And there are a number of folks out there who are self-isolating alone. I want to be clear that self-isolating does not mean you were in the house alone. That means you may be in the house, as Gail is in the house with a large family. Ilana has a cat and a partner. Like there is these additions to there being more within there, but there are those who are out there who may have just started seeing someone pre-quarantine or pre-self-isolation or doing social distancing, and it isn't an option to go to a restaurant or a bar in New York right now. It isn't an option to be any more than 6 feet from each other is a recommendation. What have you seen any trends of what people are doing now? Do you feel like that we're just going to be FaceTiming and virtually dating for the next 3 months? And where does this dating world stand?
Who are you asking? Are you asking me this?
I am asking Ashley, but if anyone's got any other tips, I'm sure people are like,
yeah, this has been on my mind a lot, so I'm glad you brought it up. It's been very funny. I've been hearing a lot of stories about people who, were just about to finally go on a date with someone that they had, kind of been eyeing for a while, and then, all of this sort of descended on us. And people who've been on a couple really promising dates and then couldn't go on anymore. It's actually a story I'm hoping to report out the rest of very soon. So if you're watching this and you would like to talk, obviously get in touch. But certainly I'm really, really interested in, what is going to happen to a lot of these new and sort of budding relationships. It's a really valid question. What I imagine, best case scenario is, people keep in touch. This is a great time for video chatting, certainly. Like you said, it's not It's not ideal. It's certainly better than nothing, especially in cases like these. What I wouldn't recommend is only ever texting. Like, I think, like I was just saying, you lose so much. You lose so much real humanity and real meaning in conversations you have over text that you would very easily pick up from a phone call or a video chat. I think it's a great time for people who are younger to get back in the habit of making phone calls to people that they are seeing.
I definitely.
I'll just chime in there if that's okay, because this is a lot of what I see. I'm seeing it at home. I have 20-something daughters, but I'm seeing it in the community quite a bit, because the reality is that when we have traumatic situations occur, particularly, I mean, all the time, people, we're humans. We have an instinct to bond. Social connection is hugely important, particularly romantic connection, and sex. It's important. But particularly when there are traumatic events, like a natural disaster or 9/11, a terrible epidemic, it's very common, in fact, to see a bump in babies happening a year after such an event, because being with somebody, sexually speaking, romantically speaking, is very life affirming. And so as a defense mechanism, almost against what's going on that's threatening mortality, people want to bond and be together physically. And so something like this, where they literally physically cannot necessarily be together, is particularly difficult. But I think that still the drive will be there. And so actually, my understanding is that we're seeing more swiping than we're seeing a bump in swipes. Not that people can necessarily, as you pointed out, do what they would have done before with their swipes. But maybe what we're going to see is a bit of a reversal of the trend that has been going on for quite some time, which I think has its not so good side, which is maybe people will start talking with each other and relating to each other and building something that either they decide this is something good and I want to keep it going, or it's not and I'm moving on, before they say, hi, nice to meet you, let's have sex, now let's see if we get along, and anything is happening here. So it might reverse that order. I don't know that that's necessarily a terrible thing, but it will be, it will definitely challenge the creative human spirit. But I believe the humans have it in us to do that.
I've been definitely seeing artists that I know posting resources around how to cyber sex. Definitely seeing that also from a lot of folks who do sex work, like talking about and sharing that skills and that knowledge for the single dating community, which is it's so interesting. Like, everybody sort of wants to chip in and throw down with the skills that they have to help other people, and that is one of them. So
that's pretty amazing. And in a strange way, brought up a question we just got about training and education. Because one of the things I think a lot of people have been dealing with, and we got this question from Tatiana on Twitter, and I think this is a question that's coming up for a lot of folks. One of my good colleagues has a son who's got special needs. My sister has 2 kids. My other sister has 5 kids. All these kids are not in school. Folks had to move home from college. They had to move home from law school. There was no staying for classes, right? And there's this idea, while we had seen a lot of education, a lot of classrooms with Blackboard and all the other systems that had come out, move to virtual, there still was the benefit of the classroom. And so, how do you see the importance? And I think this is for everybody on the panel, because I think everybody's work touches on this just a little bit. In this idea of education and training, and whether it is learning skills, whether it is teaching organizing, whether it is learning other people. How do you see the importance of technology for education at this time? And do you think and I'm going to add this on, Tatiana, do you think there is a gap? We'll start off with Dr. Schultz.
I mean, technology is going to play a vital role because people cannot be in the classroom. Do I think that it will be second best? In some ways, yes. Maybe in some particular areas, no. But in many areas, yes. But it will be it will be hugely important, as in many arenas, colleges, law schools, K through 12 are figuring out how they can move a curriculum to an online venue. How can they engage students in that, since you're sitting at a screen? How many people can you have? How can you make it interactive? How can you make it creative? And sort of in a matter of weeks, having to soup up and do the best they can with that. But I'm very impressed with what I'm already seeing happen. Even one of my kids, besides classes being online, she was in a lab. And the lab has also had to morph and figure out how to move interactions and lab work. Now, obviously, the lab that had mice that were being injected, you cannot do that virtually. So sad about that. But other things where it's an observation of certain things or computation of certain things is actually able to be moved somewhat online, or some of the work done online. And so I'm impressed that in many arenas it's working. It's hard to maintain your attention at the same level when you are not having the social aspects in it. So it's going to challenge a lot of people. I think what we just have to realize is that this is not forever, but certain things may be found along the way. I guess I'll say that may still really have use afterwards.
As someone who's been in leading webinars for folks in skills training as my primary thing for a couple of years, one of the big suggestions I have for people is to remember to give other people specific questions directed to them to ask and answer and interact with. A lot of the formats will also have interactive polls that you can do. So you can poll the room, launch that, get people's feedback, respond to that. But then also recognize that everything will take longer than you think it will. Set up pivoting from one topic to another, getting everybody started and rolling. Everything takes a lot more time to transition between, which then brings me to my other point, which is that I have a lot of friends who are professors. They're all adjuncts. They're pivoting to do all the stuff online, and no one is paying them for the additional work and effort that they're spending to do this. And that people are just being expected to be able to take this on, even though they're already making poverty wages.
I can talk about this a little bit from a pure education standpoint. A colleague of mine and I collaborated to do a story about just like what it will look like for American schools to close down for a long time as a result of the coronavirus precautions. And he was reporting from Hong Kong, where they're a little bit ahead of us on the trajectory of their battle against COVID-19. But what we were finding is that, one of the biggest hurdles to moving everything online was an access question. It's easy to gloss over and easy to forget in obviously arenas like these, that so much of the US is like just not able to mobilize that in a school district sense. And so that just created huge gaps between, the districts that would continue learning as usual and the districts where students were just going to fall behind. So that could very much have like long-term consequences for there may eventually be kids who need like remedial sort of summer school classes. But the other thing that we learned reporting out this story was just how important the classroom physically is to learning, in that it keeps everybody in a space where they at least have to pretend that they're learning or pretend that they're listening. Like what they were finding was that, especially like teenagers and college kids, it was like they could be tuned into a lecture like theoretically, but there was nothing keeping those kids actually tuned in and engaged.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I started law school at a time where laptops were just being allowed, and I will tell you, even then, sorry to my law school professors, which also does bring up another aspect of this. As a creative, I'm actually really interested in this because I think now, yes, phones. Creatives are now getting even more creative. Lena, I am so sorry if I murdered your name.
It's Ilana. Yeah.
Huh? No.
Ilana.
It's we have a question from Twitter from Lena. She's saying that she's getting creative as a principal of an art PR company by taking her clients' gallery exhibitions and making them virtual. She's also coaching clients through PR and marketing strategies that include more engaging content like IG Live Artist Talks. What can you kind of talk about? Because I know this is also something, to be very real, this is something that has kind of been on everyone's plate for a while. The government has been looking at this in trainings. Different folks have taken their sexual discrimination and sexual assaults trainings online. Folks have been really trying to, even the military has been really looking at what does this look like? Like, how do we take, particularly when you have a national footprint, a global footprint in this age of globalization, how do you get more creative with this engagement, stepping further than just a person-to-person conversation, more than just a group conversation? What have you guys seen, and what are your suggestions on getting a little bit more creative in the work that you're doing? And we can actually start off with Ilana.
I think that we are hopefully in a position where people are allowed to be more experimental. And sometimes that means things won't work well. And you have to give people the space to say, well, that was choppy, we'll try it again. And to have grace for each other when things don't run smoothly. But I'm seeing people like bringing elements of play into their online communications, and being like introducing things like literally like costumes and drawing and visuals into how they're communicating with other people online. And that the pieces that we're doing, within activism, we're thinking about how can we make an impact and be heard in a scale when we can't physically necessarily occupy in a space. And the kind of creative skills that artists bring to it are incredibly important in that, because the art, if you're able to share it online, can have a very big impact in what people see. But we want to connect people wanting to make visual statements with groups that are doing work that have concrete demands of things they want to see and change. And one of the things that we've been working on for a while is trying to get those communities together in the same room, and also to highlight the creative and artistic voices in the activism space as well. I think when you are trying to bring attention or be disruptive in some way, that visual storytelling becomes even more important, and that you can't rely on things like press releases or in a really straightforward march around in a circle picket line. Like, we're going to figure out what are the online things that we can do to shift on that.
Dr. Schultz?
I think that in my field, this has been something that's, I mean, getting creative is something that's been ramping up for some time. So there's been a big increase in use of apps to treat. I mean, the reason for most of the motivation, I guess I'll say, is there are many areas, to your earlier point about education and access. There are many areas that don't have access. And that's, by the way, one thing that schools provide. So it's a real problem right now for kids who cannot be in school. Schools are the place that many kids get their mental health care. Mm-hmm. You know, that is where the school psychologist is, or the school social worker, in addition to, losing out on peers and other things that help with mental health. But because there are many places where either there are not practitioners, which is only going to get worse, because we're seeing there will be a decline in the number of psychiatrists available. Fewer people are going into the field, and particularly in child psychiatry, not enough available. And because of cost of treatment. And even though supposedly we passed parity, I have to be honest and tell you, it doesn't look that way to practitioners or to patients. There does not appear to be parity in terms of medical care and mental health care. But because of that dearth of care, I guess I'll say, I think many practitioners and groups are getting creative about how to reach people in a less expensive and more ubiquitous and perhaps a virtual way. And so that has been through the development of numerous apps. Some have data to back them up and some do not. So there's a certain amount of buyer beware, unfortunately. And I think you have to, you really need to go to a trusted source to know if this is really an appropriate app that's going to be helpful to you or not. And as I said, the growth of telemedicine and the growth of various forms of connecting, I guess I'll say. It could be connecting to a mental health professional, for example, something like Talkspace, where it's all done through text, which I will tell you is certainly not as good as in person or not as good as Skyping or, face to face, but text availability of a person, which is much less expensive, and sometimes better than nothing, and kind of omni available no matter where you are. And then there are various platforms starting to develop to just help people connect to each other, because social connection of a certain sort is something that literally I would prescribe in my office to people who are struggling with depression or anxiety, for instance.
May I ask a question actually about that? My understanding is that a lot of insurance won't cover any telemedicine. Do you know if there's how fast will it take for them to start paying for people's needs?
Well, it's very interesting because right now it appears that in this crisis, there has been a decision made to, in fact, treat the telemedicine appointment exactly the same as if it were an in-office appointment and reimburse accordingly. So it's interesting that it's taken this to happen for that to happen. But I do wonder when this resolves, is there the possibility of continuing that? Because for many people, that is all that they can have. So, I don't know the answer to that, but abruptly, as in this past week, we've been told that appointments by telemedicine will be treated the same as regular appointments. And in fact, even that we can use modes of connecting, because, most practitioners individually do not have Zoom, right? I mean, it costs money, or they don't have an account with something in particular, or they're not comfortable because they're not used to using it. But we're now being told suddenly you can, even though this before wasn't considered HIPAA safe, now you can use Skype, you can use FaceTime in this time period. So it makes it much more available to many more people quickly. And so, I don't know what will happen, but this seems to me to be a good thing.
And I'll say really quickly too, that where I've seen sort of creativity come into play in sort of a social context is it's been really interesting to me to see just the way people behave when geography is no longer a factor. Like everybody who's not physically with you is one Skype call away or is one phone call away, right? And so like the ways in which people behave when, someone's not down the street or not a country away, they're, both equally available, have been really, really interesting. One thing, I started thinking about this when I, for example, Skyped into a yoga class in Minnesota last night because it was near where my parents live. And I was like, oh, we can do this together. And, I was just starting to think about how, I have one friend who, lives in Amsterdam, and we could very easily get together and take a workout class when we really could not do that otherwise. Or at least we wouldn't think to, because we do this, in our own neighborhoods. And I've seen a few businesses and groups sort of take real advantage of this. Like museums are giving tours to anybody around the world who wants to visit. Like I could tour the Louvre right now if I wanted to from my apartment here in New York. So I have seen a real blossoming of creativity now that everybody is in their home and in front of their screen. Even
on an individual level, I have a friend book group. And we were really disappointed that we wouldn't be getting together. Everybody was really excited about the book. So we're going to now have a hangout virtually, and everybody will have their own cocktail, and we will have our book group. And I do see these are not tech savvy people, let me just say.
Well, and I think this actually leads to kind of the last question that we got, and a great question to kind of end on. And I'll help reframe it to make it a little bit broader. This does leave people in this concept of self-isolation. Do you see folks who are doing less perfect digital media? For example, less perfect IG feeds during this time of self-isolation. Will we see folks be what they are, which is human? Because we've talked a lot about tech. We've talked a lot about platforms, but what will we see out of this unfiltered, face-tuned kind of idea where this is now our mode of connecting?
I think this has really been the great flattener on social media. Like everybody's at home, nobody's anywhere glamorous, unless you're one of the privileged few that live somewhere glamorous. But for most of us, we're just at home in our slippers and making the most of it. And I think that includes a lot of people who are famous and who do have a lot of influence are also, in the same boat. So it has had a real democratizing effect, I think.
I think that people are being more honest and open about how marginal their lives are in terms of financial stability. And I'm so excited to see people bringing these, yoga, training, music classes online, but we have to get into the practice of paying people for that work, right? And so I'm seeing people talk more honestly about their need for money. And I think that there is a potential to have real organizing for worker power, right? Because yoga teachers are workers. And in fact, they're organizing a labor union. It's called Yoga Union. You can check it out on Twitter now. They'll be at my conference. But you can see that people are recognizing their own necessity in the economic system and how barely they're able to scrape by, and talking about it more openly in a way that I think is really powerful and will lead to significant change.
I certainly agree with both of you. In addition, I guess I would say, no matter what's going on, humans are still humans. And when you're scared and you're anxious and you have been forced into a transition that is extremely abrupt and really huge, you're going to be vulnerable. And the best answer to that is social connection. And I think that humans are really driven to find it no matter what, in whatever way. And so I'm grateful actually that there is the technological ability to do that, and that adds more creativity to it. But I will say that I am concerned for groups that are really suffering and struggling and were before and don't have the technology really available to them to really make the kind of use of it that a lot of people will, and will feel more marginalized and more isolated and more frightened and forced to do things that frankly are dangerous for them, or really from a mental health perspective will really suffer far more without the ability to necessarily have help for that. So I do worry that there are groups that are not going to as easily be able to come along for at least this part of the ride, and that is not a good thing. We have to figure out what to do about that.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. We had one final comment that came through email, and I can kind of guess what folks' answers will be. Is are any of you worried that we might get so good at this digital thing that people will get out of the habit of going to restaurants and going to the theater, that kind of stuff? If they, are we doing virtual book club forever? Is that where we're at?
I don't think so. I mean, I think people need to be with people, and I don't think we're ever going to be like a Star Trek episode of like we're brains or we're in the Matrix or whatever. So I think people will be drawn always to, you can watch any Broadway show you want online, but people want to go to the theater, right? I mean, there are all kinds of things that are available in a technology world, but people still want to go and be there because there's a different feeling about it. There's 100% different feeling about it. So I don't think we will lose it. I think we will just invent more options. But I'll tell you, you might be able to watch Hamilton online, but people are still going to kill for a ticket to be there. I don't think it's really going to change.
I mean, the problem is going to be that these arts spaces might not be there for people when we're allowed to be out again. We need a national investment in supporting arts institutions and supporting theater, including film spaces. And I don't mean like the big AMC, I mean independent theaters, independent cinema, or else when we're finally allowed out of the house again, they will not exist anymore. And the artists who create the work that's supposed to go in them cannot feed themselves right now. So we're seeing these big money being sent to the heads of the airline industry and it's not even making it to the stewardesses. And we're seeing no conversation about what is the bailout program for the entire arts and entertainment sector. And I don't mean Sony. I mean the people who we connect with online and whose work we're appreciating and enjoying now in these independent theater spaces, because they will not be able to open up again after this unless someone is paying them now. But people will want to. We'll want to see each other more than ever.
I think a lot of attractions where other people are the appeal, I guess you could say, like, going to book club, going to a restaurant or a bar, going to the theater with someone who, you're excited to see a show with, that kind of thing, to whatever extent, like Alana said, these establishments are still around, will still be, appealing to people when all this is over. I do think it has raised real questions already about the necessity of going to the office for a lot of professions. People in my work, like, for example, what I do for work is I show up at places where I need to report, or I make phone calls, and otherwise I'm just sitting at my computer writing. And there's a lot of that can always be done from home. I did it for a long time as a freelancer, and I think now we're all kind of realizing that, like, it's a viable workspace at home. So I think there are real questions about how work will continue on from here.
And I think there also is a very real question, and a listener actually asked it as well. Are we going to see? And I'd love to toss this to Dr. Saltzman first. I know I tricked you twice. One more last question. Are we going to see widespread PTSD where folks are extremely scared to be around other folks, to gather, because of what has happened, because of how starkly different these last few months have been? And how does that now impact how we interact in the future?
Well, I think you won't call that PTSD. There will be more folks with PTSD, but those will be the folks who, and there will be quite a few of them, who have become really ill and had to be in the hospital setting and possibly in an ICU setting. It's not uncommon to have PTSD after being intubated in an ICU for a period of time. And so there's going to be a burden of a group of patients who survive but need a lot of help and are debilitated in many ways. But that's different. I think your questioner is asking, are we all going to be avoidant because we're paranoid and afraid that, a light has been shown that it's possible to infect each other, and does that mean it's dangerous to be together? I think it will really be based on the data, and maybe it'll take us a little bit of time to sort of readjust again. But I don't think that that's likely to be the case. I think those people who tend to be fearful about hypochondriacal things, or tend to be obsessive, and the realm of their obsessiveness is, for example, germs or cleanliness or being contaminated in some way. And don't get me wrong, that there are a lot of people who have those feelings. So if you're in that camp, it might be harder for you, and you might actually even need to dip into some treatment to sort of deal with the panic, anxiety feelings that you have about re-exposing yourself. And I would advise one to do that before one shrank one's world too much. But for most people, once the data is in that we are okay, essentially, whether that's we're okay because the terrible thing has happened and the rest of us that are here have herd immunity, or whether that has happened because we've developed a vaccine, or because we've discovered that chloroquine or some other medication, in fact, does treat the virus. I think people will come back out. We've seen that before. There have been other plagues throughout history, other terrible viruses and illnesses throughout history. There have been other kinds of fears. Post 9/11, the fear was going anywhere you risked death by another terrorist attack, right? There were people who were afraid to go on the subways. There were people who were afraid to fly. And so some people had a much harder time and needed some help. But most people over time were really able to go back to their old normal, because we are resilient. We are resilient beings. And if I had to say sort of a hopeful note at the end, it would be that what we're talking about today is building a lot of coping tools, right, for this difficult time. And building a box of coping tools is great for the individual psyche and for the individual human being. And over time, using coping tools to get through a very difficult time, but coming out the other end, even if it was awful, builds resilience ultimately and makes us more resilient human beings for whatever lays next. So I think people will come back to, you know, the way, I mean, now economically, I don't know what things will look like and the way things will be. But I think interactionally and in terms of humanity, people will recoup. It'll just take some time.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here today and thank the audience as well. Thank you, Elena Levin, who is the program director at New Media Mentors, a project of Netroots Nation. Ashley Fetters, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she reports on relationships and families, and I hope you keep reporting more. And Dr. Gail Saltz, who is an associate professor of psychiatry at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, and a host. A personality, a podcast on iHeartRadio. Thank you all for being here and experimenting with us on this very first time doing a completely virtual show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.